Hello and welcome to this month's Chat for Change. My name is Hannah and I'm here with Noa Kageyama this month. So before we get started, just a few household bulletins. This is actually the first event out of 4 that we're doing this month as part of our Musicians Health Month, Awareness Beyond the Instrument. So we still have events coming up with Feldenkrais workshop, mental training, and a breathing workshop. Those will be every Tuesday evening at 8 p.m. Central European time, and we hope to reconnect with some of our listeners there. Below this chat, you'll also find a donate button. So all of the proceeds that we're gathering during this month will be going to an organization called CAS, which is an organization based in Düsseldorf that supports kids with arts education. But either way, thanks for tuning in, and let's get started. So Noa is, to my knowledge, one of the most successful music psychologists in the US. He's currently on the faculty of the Juilliard School of Music, the New World Symphony in Florida, and teaches workshops all around the country. However, Noa is probably most well known for the Bulletproof Musician, which is a blog of I'm a huge fan. I'm actually on your subscriber list so that I can get all of your emails, all of your new articles straight to my inbox. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your story, kind of how you got started, and what brought you from violin to performance psychology?
Sure. So I started off as a little Suzuki kid when I was 2 years old. My cousins had already been doing some Suzuki stuff in upstate New York where they lived. And I don't think my mom knew a ton about it, but she was kind of intrigued and seemed like a nice way to spend some time with family that summer. So we went up to Ithaca College and I had my first summer workshop. And I didn't learn a whole lot because, I was just I learned how to hold the violin or hold like a Cracker Jack box with a ruler taped to it with like a little stick without dropping it, and bowing to a D major chord. And so that's how it started. I think my mom was a little bit underwhelmed, but was kind of really taken by the philosophy and this idea that, in the same way that kids learn languages without classwork, at the age of 6 months, that maybe we all have more latent talent and abilities in the area of music than we might realize. And so she was reading his book and got so into it that actually, I don't know how she did this, but she managed to find his mailing address and his phone number and would like call him at whatever hour it was over there, and got him to agree to teach me if we showed up at his school. And so one day in the middle of kindergarten, my mom took me out of school. I flew over to Japan. I studied with Dr. Suzuki for about 6 months. And around that time, I started to intuit that, music wasn't just an optional, maybe you practice, maybe you don't sort of activity, but there's more expectations there. And so from that point onwards, it just kind of progressed like a lot of other young musicians do, with driving to lessons and youth orchestra, chamber music, theory. Ended up being a lot of driving in my case. I grew up in Central Ohio, so we would drive to Oberlin or Cleveland Institute or Cincinnati Conservatory, or at one point we were driving to Chicago on the weekends, and then I was flying to New York in high school for pre-college. And so lots of traveling for lessons, and I was doing fine and, getting the best training that I could have asked for. But even from the time I was like 5 or 6, I did notice nerves. I didn't know how to describe it at the time, but I knew something felt different, and that something often led to not great performances, sometimes even like kind of catastrophic ones with memory slips and just freaking out a little bit backstage and so forth. And so I was essentially kind of frustrated all the time by not playing the way that I sounded in the practice room, and also not enjoying the aspect of nerves that I usually experienced physically and so forth. And so this is pre-internet, right? So the only reference that we really had were like encyclopedias and like maybe the library. And so I didn't really know what to do other than to ask my teachers. And usually their response was some variation of, maybe I should practice a little bit more or at all or consistently. And that was true. Like I wasn't ever practicing adequately. But eventually, in college, I did start practicing more, and that didn't change things as much as I hoped that it might. Like, it didn't hurt. I did get better, but not vastly better for the amount of time that I put in. And
Mhm.
also nerves didn't really change and performances were still hit or miss. So I really didn't understand it. And eventually got to Juilliard for my master's, and they were teaching or offering a class taught by Don Green on performance psychology. And I'd never heard of that before. I didn't know what sports psychology was and was intrigued. And so I took the class and really didn't expect much from it, but was really surprised at how much research had been done on why athletes can sometimes perform poorly and sometimes why they perform well, and what sorts of skills were involved in ensuring that there was less of a gap between training and performance, and also more consistency in performance itself. I found it really fascinating, but also really useful. Like I started practicing some of these mental skills, and it changed how I practiced on a day-to-day basis. It changed how I approached performing and prepared for performing. And I ended up doing an international competition my second year there, and honestly did better than I should have done because I was still having difficulty motivating myself to practice. Yet I went in not being super well prepared, but playing better than I had any right to expect to be able to play given my level of preparation. And so that's where I started realizing that, okay, maybe there really was something to this mental side. Um, and I was also not sure what I wanted to do after school. Like, it
Mhm.
wasn't clear to me if I should audition for orchestras or do some teaching, or I didn't really find any of those things especially appealing at the time. And sports psych, on the other hand, was really intriguing to me. So I went back to school, or stayed in school for a bunch of years further, got my PhD in psychology, um, and then really continued to try to look for ways to take what athletes and coaches have already known and are benefiting from for decades, and trying to translate that into exercises or techniques or strategies that musicians could also benefit from.
Okay. Yeah, and so how did you start with the Bulletproof Musician?
Well, blogs did exist back when I started. This was maybe like 2008, 2009. I started thinking about it. I was reading blogs myself, trying to learn about, because I was, I'd finished my PhD, was working in a group practice, working with, I don't want to say like normal people, but like non-performance population. So the typical sort of anxiety, depression, relationship issues, work issues, and so forth. And I'd always known that that wasn't what I wanted to do and who I wanted to work with. I was really interested in working more with, like, this one executive came in having difficulty with public speaking, and I was like, oh, that's really kind of exciting to me. Like,
Mhm.
that's the sort of thing I wanted to do, and I wanted to find ways of working with more of that type of person, but particularly musicians. And so um, what I was reading on blogs and on the internet was that, oh, you should start a blog and um, try to find an audience for the kinds of things that you're hoping to work on or with. And so I wasn't sure how to do that or what to do, but I just started writing articles about practice or things that I knew, and um, was worried that I would run out of things to write about after like a couple months. But it's been, what is it, 12 years now or something, 10 years, 11 years. And apparently there's more to write about. So that's just, I mean, it didn't start with any grand vision. It just started as a way to continue to kind of learn for myself or educate myself on um, all that was out there in the research world. So
Mhm. And so on the website, you also offer courses that we can sign up for. So do you want to tell us a little bit about those and how they work and kind of what the goal is if you sign up for one of them?
sure. So that too didn't start with any particular kind of plan or vision. I started teaching a regular 15 week semester long course at Juilliard on effective practice and how to manage nerves and prepare more effectively for performances and bounce back from mistakes and get into the zone, like all the kinds of things that sports psychologists generally work with athletes on. And that was around the time when I started seeing classes or courses pop up online, um, generally oriented around different kinds of skills and so forth. So I was like, well, that's kind of cool. Like, you can learn how to knit, or you can learn how to start your own website. And it's like, well, I wonder what would happen if I put this class that I was teaching live online, but as like a non-live kind of thing that I was seeing. And so it started off just as like kind of an experiment to see what would happen. And ended up taking, months and months to actually put it together, but was surprised when I found that people were signing up and people were sending me emails and saying, oh, like this changed how I practice, or, had the first positive experience I've had at an audition, or I won an audition, or was able to perform for family and friends without freaking out like I always have in the past. And so yeah, that's kind of how it started. And now it's turned into, what with Zoom being so ubiquitous now, it's turned into live versions as well as self-study versions.
Okay, very cool. You also mentioned like how performance psychology really changed the way that you practiced and that you prepared. So I'm wondering, could you give us a little bit of an idea, like what proportion of our practice should be spent on performing versus like the grunt work and the note learning? And how can we set up a performance or a way of practicing that's good for the performing?
So it's hard to prescribe a specific amount of time, but I remember even in grad school reading a book that the great violin pedagogue Galamian had written years ago, and it was his thought that there were three different elements to practice. One part of it is more conceptual, where, I mean, before we work on a puzzle, for instance, it kind of helps to know what the puzzle is a picture of, right? Because if you have no idea, then it's really difficult to imagine what should go where. So whether it's score study or listening recordings or even just playing through the piece and kind of thinking about it, it does help to have a concept of what our aim is, whether it's, the type of vibrato that really fits best here, or the kind of sound that we want, or the kind of articulation or phrasing and so forth. So taking a little bit of time to do that is something that I certainly neglected in my younger years, and just kind of dove right into solving technical problems, because that is another part of practice. And I believe he called that building time. And so once we know what we want, we do have to figure out how to solve the various technical challenges associated with making what it is that we want come out of our instrument. But even then, once we're able to sort out those problems, we have to be able to play something from beginning to end without stopping, without doing a particular tricky section 2, 3, 4, 5 times to get it to sound right, and to be able to also handle a little bit of pressure. And so he said that, we tend to do too little performance practice and too late. And I think that's probably fair for most of us, given
Mhm.
how much we try to avoid recording ourselves or playing for other people until the very last minute. So there are various ways of incorporating more balance between those three elements into our daily practice. I think one thing that I really like, that there's a percussionist named Rob Knopper who's at the Met, who many of your listeners may be familiar with. But one thing that I like that he did in preparing for his audition was he started recording himself and doing run throughs of his orchestral excerpts like months in advance of the actual audition. I think most folks would, get things sounding good first and then start recording. And even when recording, record at the end of a practice session, right? But what he did is he would wake up every morning, do kind of a short warm up just to get his fingers warm, but not touch any of his excerpts, and then run some portion of the list to get a snapshot of where those excerpts really truly are, the most honest look at where those excerpts are, as if that were audition day.
Mhm.
Clearly not the funnest way to start off the day. It's not the most flattering, but like I said, the most honest look at where those excerpts really are. And based on that, it would give him, a pretty clear roadmap or to-do list of how to spend his time that day. And the other thing that I like about this is, and this is a whole other direction or angle that we can get at, is in the same way that sometimes we'll have something memorized, but we'll be using the music anyway. And then suddenly you look at the music and like you get disoriented and you're like, wait, where am I? Like, what's going on? Like, you know, that feeling of just being confused all of a sudden under pressure.
Mhm.
The same sort of thing can happen with our thoughts, as in, when we're practicing or we're doing run throughs and it's comfortable or it's a lesson and we don't really have anything to worry about, we don't worry about what we're thinking about. We just kind of, maybe our mind wanders a little bit here and there, or we think about the sound, or we think about the piano part, or think about what kind of sandwich we want for lunch. And it's all fine and things go okay. But then suddenly on stage, it can be really easy for our mind to kind of freak out, and not only kind of have a mind of its own where it starts worrying about the audition committee or the audience or a difficult shift coming up or beating ourselves up for having missed a note or played something out of tune, sometimes we can start wondering, well, what am I supposed to think about? Which itself is a whole train of thinking that can derail our performance. And so part of what's nice about doing more regular run throughs and recording ourselves is we can start to practice essentially choreographing our thoughts and having a clearer script of what to think about from one note or one phrase or one passage to the next. Because it might be that thinking about technical things in one particular tricky section is going to totally mess us up, where it's more important, perhaps, or more helpful to focus on the kind of sound that we want or the kind of direction of the phrase and where it is that our destination is, or maybe even paying more attention to what the pianist is doing at that point and making sure certain elements are aligned and so forth. So we don't spend a lot of time choreographing our thoughts, but that is something that we can test out and experiment a lot more with when we are recording ourselves and doing more run throughs, instead of suddenly at an audition or a performance having that moment where it's like, oh crap, I don't know what to think about right now, and discovering that our brain wants to think about all the least helpful things.
Right. No, and I could definitely imagine that that also really helps with consistency and just like showing up more consistently in the way that you might want to. I'm also wondering because I also really struggle like judging in the practice room how ready something is. Like this is kind of a stupid question. Like how do I know if I'm prepared? But how do I know if I'm prepared? Because sometimes I go on stage and something that was sounding great in a practice room just doesn't work. And
Right.
then after a couple of performances, I realized like, okay, so it's working better now, but it took me those performance moments to get there.
Yeah, that's a really good question. And it goes to something that's known as the mastery illusion. I discovered this I mean, I think we've all discovered it, but without realizing it. But I remember discovering this in music history, like the first class that you take, at college at Oberlin as a music student is music history. Everyone gets packed into a hall and there's a lecture, um, and our job, actually the professor told us at the time, just write down everything I say because it's going to be on the test. And so we dutifully wrote things down, and I did study my notes. I read the book, but I didn't really know how to study. So I just read my notes, reviewed the book, went to the test, and I think I got like a C or a C minus. I got a bad grade. I was kind of shocked because once I got to the test, I realized, wow, like this stuff seems familiar, but I don't remember the answer. And
Mm-hmm.
so this is the kind of mastery illusion where, like, when I was studying, say that in quotes, because I was just reviewing or rereading the book or notes, everything seemed pretty familiar. It's like, oh yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, I got that. But then when I actually had to retrieve information from my head, I found that I couldn't retrieve things because I hadn't actually practiced retrieval. So the mastery illusion is where we think we have a certain level of mastery over something, but it's an illusion because it's a function of having repeated something over and over and over and over. So in the practice room, for instance, when we start off at minute zero of a practice session, generally that's where things really are. But after a few minutes, tricky passage, a few shifts involved, the second repetition's better, but not where we want it. Third's better still. By the time we get to the fifth or sixth repetition, we feel like, okay, I got this. This sounds good. And, from repetition 6 to 10, we might be able to do it 3, 4, 5 times in a row exactly the way that we want. It's like, okay, it's sorted out now. The reality, though, is that's not really where our learning is. The only way to find out how well something's been learned is to see where things are at on the first repetition tomorrow, say, or the first repetition later in the day. So when we say that it sounded better in the practice room, what we're really doing is we're comparing the first time under pressure to like the last time when we were comfortable, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what we really have to be able to do is capture or expose the mastery illusion. And that comes back to the recording ourselves and starting off days with recording where things are at or doing a run through of where things are at. Because that we don't want to face that honesty sometimes, but that's actually where our learning is actually at that moment. And so I think if we give ourselves permission to like sound a little bit bad every day, knowing that we're going to improve on it, it can make it a lot easier to find out when something's ready or when something's learned, because then we're actually testing what's going to be demanded of us in performance and able to work on those things accordingly.
Okay. Yeah. And also, you mentioned like being able to choreograph our thoughts, and all of that also includes kind of getting into a headspace where even on stage you can really direct your thoughts in a good way. And Don Green talks a lot about making a pre-performance routine and also kind of setting yourself up before going on stage. So I was wondering what your take on that was. If you believe in pre-performance routines, how to structure them and how to find out what works for you.
Yeah, athletes and coaches have been utilizing pre-performance routines for decades, and you see this all the time in different sports, especially in what are called closed skill sports. So things like the first serve or the second serve in tennis. There are no routines for in the middle of a rally when you're hitting balls back and forth and you just have to run to the next one and hit it to where you want to go. There's no like routine for that. It's more when it's just you and a scale and you have time to really prepare yourself and get into the right headspace and like physical state. And it's not really super clear from the research, I don't think, like what exactly has to be in a pre-performance routine, but the idea is to get into a more optimal physical state, so making sure there's not excess tension, and also get into a more optimal mental state. And there are a variety of ways of doing that. There are different elements that seem to be important or useful for getting into a better mental state for different pre-performance routines. um, Breathing seems to be a pretty universally spoken about element. Clearing the mind, quieting the mind. There are some studies that have looked at how kind of visualizing the targets, or in the case of musicians, having auditory imagery involved and hearing the kind of sound that you want, the kind of articulation of that first note, the initial attack, and so forth, can be a helpful way of making sure you're focused on what you want. Because there's some golf studies and so forth which have found that imagining what you don't want does tend to contribute to more mistakes. Interestingly, it seems that imagining what you do want seems not to have as positive effect as imagining what you don't want is negative. But as long as we're focused on what we do want, it kind of takes up the space that would otherwise be tempted to imagine what we don't want. So yes, imagining what we do want. And that for some people isn't just what you want to hear coming out of your instrument, but sometimes is even, the kind of general feel of how the first note is when everything goes well. Like, the bow kind of landing softly onto the string, or the kind of attack that's going to be there and so forth, or the kind of air support that you need. And depends on the instrument, depends on the person, but there's some indications that a general feel can be really helpful as well. Not a really specific, detailed micromanaging type of experience. Like, you don't want to be thinking about what exactly your thumb should be doing, and where your pinky should be pointed, or where your elbow is relative to your shoulder and all that. Like, that's too much detail, which is probably going to lead to messing up actually, or choking. But yeah, there are certainly a set of ingredients that do seem to be generally useful across different instruments and across different people. But one of the challenges is figuring out what collection of these ingredients really works best for you, and getting better at utilizing them and making it more of a habit. And even from piece to piece, excerpt to excerpt, it's going to be a little bit different, because the mood of each excerpt or piece is different, the character is different, and you might need to be more energy or lower energy. And this is where a lot of times people will use different images or different emotion words or adjectives and so forth, to try to get into the right character and hear a different thing, or have a different kind of feel before each excerpt or piece.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And I have a really good friend from Oberlin who was really excited when she heard that I was interviewing you. And she had a really good question, which was she was talking about how when you get on stage, often, like even if you've worked on your mental mindset and mentally everything seems to be working well, sometimes when you're on stage, your body just reverts back into old bad habits. And I've always learned that in a way, your body is a little bit of a slower learner than your head. So is that true? And if it is true, how do we get our bodies and our brains to be more in sync on stage and to get more into a flow?
The answer that's probably most helpful but least popular is, because I think there's a lot to be said for how things that we learn under pressure, um, do sometimes stick. better than things that we might have tried to drill over and over, but really haven't tested out under pressure. And we also tend to trust things that work under pressure. And it's hard to trust things that might have worked over and over in the practice room, but we've never really tested it out in pressure. And so, I mean, I'm speaking about this from, this might not be an analogy that resonates, but my son started doing Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu a number of years ago, and then I started along with him. And every class is spent, with a warm-up, and then you learn a new skill or two, and then you kind of put it to the test, and you spend the rest of the class like essentially wrestling and rolling around on the ground with other people who are trying to prevent you from choking them. Well, actually, they're trying to choke you, and so everyone's trying to choke each other and prevent each other from choking each other. So you're actually trying out these things and seeing if they actually work against someone who's not cooperating with you any longer, like they were in the drills. And I just noticed that there are certain things that everyone keeps reverting to because they know they work under pressure. And sometimes you have to experiment, of course, and try something that may not work. But then if it does work, it's like that becomes something that just gets deeply embedded and you trust it. It's like, oh, I can do that. And so whereas all the other things that you've learned, that you drilled, and you think, okay, I'm going to try this, like it goes out the window because you don't want to mess up, and like you trust the thing that has worked in that situation. So long story short, one of the things that really can be helpful, aside from doing these run-throughs and recording yourselves where there's a tiny bit of pressure but not a ton, is to actually play for people more often, much sooner in the process. So you don't want to start off playing for the person that stresses you out the most, obviously, when you're least prepared. But once you start feeling like, okay, I can get through the repertoire, it's not performance ready by any means, maybe I'll play for a friend who I know will not think of me any less if I have a bad day and is very supportive, but still makes me a little bit uncomfortable. Let me play for that person. And then, after you've done that a few times and that starts to become more comfortable and you trust the things that you're trying to do, these new habits or these new approaches that you're trying to do, like your friend was describing, then it's time, like you kind of graduate to the next level of pressure. It's okay, all right, let's have my friend come in and listen, and maybe they can invite a friend who I don't know as well, who might be more inclined to judge me if I don't have a good day. And so like you kind of go to the next level and try out the same things. And if you prove that, okay, I can trust myself at this level, then you kind of keep going up that pressure hierarchy. Um, so for instance, David Kim, concertmaster, Philadelphia Orchestra, there's a great video of him online talking about how he prepares for performances. And he said that he'll do, if it's a normal orchestra concert, he does that all the time. So the preparation for that obviously is going to be a little more routine. But if he's been asked to perform Mendelssohn Concerto with Seattle Symphony or something like that, he doesn't do that every day of the year. And it's a little bit more of an unusual kind of performance. And there's a lot of pressure. So he said, when that's the case, he'll do like 30 or 40 practice performances in advance, like not just for his dog or family. Like he'll go to a library or retirement center, like he'll go and find a different audience 30 or 40 times with a pianist in advance to run the whole thing, to work out the kinks and start cultivating trust and try things out and get more comfortable being uncomfortable. And so and that seems like a lot. And I'm not saying that everyone has to do 30 or 40, but just as another example, Rob Knopberg, the percussionist, he did 42 mock auditions before the Met audition, one a day for 6 straight weeks. So to me, I'm thinking a normal number for most people of those kinds of practice performances is probably like in the single digits. Maybe 5 seems like a lot even. Never mind like 10. So, but if it takes somebody like David or Rob 30 or 40 to start feeling comfortable with the demands of performance, I think if we still feel uncomfortable after like 5 or 10, and old habits keep reverting or our body doesn't seem to cooperate, I think it doesn't mean that there's something wrong with us or we're never going to get it or we're not cut out for performing. I think it just means that we need to be a little more patient with ourselves and trust that if we get more comfortable being uncomfortable like that and give ourselves more opportunities to like test ourselves out and try to learn things under pressure in that sort of way, that eventually we'll get there too. Like it's not like they're superhuman. They've just gone through that difficult part of feeling uncomfortable and making mistakes and learning from it and doing so under pressure, that I think is really hard to find any sort of substitute for. and the practice room.
Okay. Yeah, and I also wanted to talk a little bit about like increased energy because like often I feel like when I'm on stage I have like the adrenaline, it throws off all of the ratios that I've like worked so hard to get right in the practice room. And like I've heard advice like you can run up and down stairs or do jumping jacks just to get your heart rate up. But I often feel like the problem isn't actually the heart rate so much as it is the fact that when I'm on stage, I just have a really razor sharp intrinsic focus that just like notices everything that's just a little bit off and that's a little bit different. And then the performance becomes something where I really don't know how it's going to go because this is not what I practiced with. And so it just feels like this really scary unknown thing. And then I just start to play it safe. And then it gets a little bit boring and I'm a little bit more tense. And so I was wondering what your thoughts were on that. Like how can we find ways to prepare for that?
Yeah, that's a really tricky thing to do too. And I mean, the good thing is that the answer is we can play a lot better than we realize or think or give ourselves credit for, even if our body doesn't feel anything like it does in the practice room. I think one of the things that happens is we tend to be, and I think you had said this, if not alluded to it, that our attention tends to be like extra sensitive on stage, and we feel like we are noticing many more imperfections than fortunately the audience even hears, or even other musicians hear. There's a great study they did at Yale with a bunch of pianists where essentially they found that even other pianists miss the vast majority of the very obvious simple note mistakes that pianists are making. I think in the case of the study, I think 6/10 of the mistakes that were made, the hundreds of mistakes, I think as a group, they only were able to identify 38% of the wrong notes or missing notes or omitted notes. And as individuals, it ranged from 7% to 22%. So most of the mistakes went unnoticed. And these are like, you would think obvious mistakes, especially because they were given copies of the music to look at in front of them as they were listening. That was their only task, to like identify the missed notes or the wrong notes. Even so, it was difficult. So all these little tiny nuances that we think are incredibly obvious and maybe even embarrassing at the time oftentimes get unnoticed by the other listeners, never mind other musicians. And even for ourselves, sometimes if we have enough space and we listen back to recording, sometimes we're kind of hard pressed to identify the thing that we thought sounded so awful. Like, it's like, is that it? Was that it? That doesn't sound so bad. That couldn't have been it. And like we keep listening and we can't find the thing that we were embarrassed about at the time. So that's one part of it. But the other part of it too is, for better or for worse, I think doing these practice performances is a helpful way of starting to figure out when our body is feeling that way, how to manage it without over controlling things so much. And once we start getting more comfortable, knowing that we can play even when our hands feel jittery or shaky or we have too much adrenaline, that tends not to spiral out of control. Because one of the things that can often happen is, once we start feeling out of control or nervous, we start worrying about it more, which increases the adrenaline response, which makes things worse physically, which makes us worry about it more, which makes it accelerate even further. And so the goal is really to kind of accept that we're going to be feeling a little bit of that energy, but find a way to make sure that it doesn't snowball out of control. And some of that, again, comes from getting comfortable, playing more freely or taking risks and so forth in advance in actual situations where we feel some of that pressure.
Okay, great. So I actually researched this and I'm not sure why, but apparently our meeting is about to end in 5 minutes. And I thought, that between two people it was supposed to be unlimited, but I guess it's not. So would you mind, we're going to cut and like splice all of this
Sure.
together, but would you mind if we just like logged out really quick and then logged back in?
Yeah.
Perfect, thank you so much. Okay, good. So that kind of brings me to my next question because obviously beta blockers are very widely used in our industry and they're very popular. And I think part of the temptation is just that they kind of maintain the physical feel you have when you practice with them on stage. And so I was wondering I've seen the whole spectrum of people who are very much against them, people who think they can be helpful. So I was wondering what your take is on that and what your thoughts were.
Yeah, I don't have a particular like ethical or moral stance on them. Also, I don't have prescription privileges, so I can't endorse them anyway in that sort of way. But what I do find interesting is why they do or don't work. And so I'm trying to think of the short version of this. So essentially, what's interesting to me about performance and nerves is that um, nerves aren't this like gumbo of things that happen to us and it's all one thing. It's fundamentally two separate elements. There's a cognitive element of anxiety, and then there's a somatic or physical element of anxiety. I think we tend to over focus on the physical. Like, our heart's racing, our hands are sweating, like our muscles are tight, we feel jittery and shaky, and we can feel it in our chest and all this stuff happening. Believe it or not, like, except for muscle tension, like that stuff is not highly correlated with performance quality. Whereas the cognitive anxiety tends to be very much correlated with anxiety. Like the more worried we are, if we're stressing out about the audience or judges, whatever people think, or difficult passages, or if we're distracted, like when you look at the research on choking and why choking happens, like this catastrophic failure under pressure, it's not because of physical things, it's because of like the both primary theories are centered around attention. Like either we're distracted by things we don't control or we are overthinking the mechanics of something. So both aren't physical, both are kind of mental. And so I think all this to say, for better for worse, beta blockers don't have a direct effect on cognitive anxiety. They only, assuming the correct dosage and timing, have an effect on somatic anxiety. And even then, it's not necessarily positive for some folks because it kind of takes too much energy away, et cetera, et cetera. But the thing with beta blockers is assuming that someone is struggling to perform their best because of the physiological things. And assuming that if you take the physiological elements off the table and they naturally then automatically focus on all like the right things to think about in a performance, then those are the people that will tend to report positive experiences with beta blockers. But a lot of folks, even if you take the physiological things off the table, they're still going to worry about making mistakes or having memory slips or feel pressure because what if they don't get this job? It's their last opportunity to do X, Y, or Z, or, you know, I've been subbing in this orchestra forever. What if they find out that I didn't make it past the prelims even, or like what's going to happen? So all these worries and doubts and fears that we have, if taking the physiological things off the table does not reduce or change our ability to focus effectively on what's most useful in the moment to perform, those are the folks who take the beta blockers and say, well, yeah, it didn't really do anything for me because like I still messed up or didn't play my best and so forth, or still felt nervous, even though physically I wasn't feeling nervous. So, so I don't know if that was answering exactly the question that you asked, but basically, those are the reasons why people tend to report mixed experiences with beta blockers, and some people will swear by them and others will not be so supportive, perhaps.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, and you kind of also talked about this, like how people respond differently physiologically to stress. So do you think there is something to be said for beta blockers in a way, also kind of evening the playing field a little bit? Because if someone is just like struggles or has a stronger physiological response, um, in a way, like if we took beta blockers off the table, they would just have to accept the fact that they're just struggling with this more than other people are. So I was wondering kind of, is there a way to think of beta blockers as like part of like a healthy way, or is it kind of an all or nothing sort of a situation?
Yeah, I mean, so the tricky thing is, of course, there are individual differences. There are even, various medical conditions and so forth where we have folks who might be more sensitive to different levels of the same activation and so forth. I'm not sure how many musicians fall in the category of that's it's a tricky question. I don't know that we know, but I think most musicians are probably kind of more in the normal range of anxiety, if that makes sense,
Mm-hmm.
where in the same way that I would hesitate for everyone to take stimulants to help with helping them focus more effectively, and how some people say that ADHD is being overdiagnosed nowadays and so forth. And so I'm a little bit hesitant to recommend medication, even if beta blockers are relatively safe, all things considered. Yeah, I still feel a little bit uncomfortable with that being the first line of defense for everyone, um, because it's hard then to know, well, when can I stop taking this, or when can I transition away, especially if one hasn't cultivated other skills or tried other things to manage their experience under pressure. Um, there's some interesting research on threat versus challenge states, how essentially if we are able to interpret or embrace the increased activation or somatic response as excitement, it's more facilitated a performance than if we interpret that as debilitative or negative. So
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a lot that we can do, or that musicians can try, um, that don't involve medication before that starts being part of the equation. And again, I'm not
Mm-hmm.
like opposed to people taking it in any, like, I'm not adamantly against it necessarily, and I don't think that everyone needs to get off of it immediately as soon as
Mm-hmm.
possible and so forth. But um but I do worry if that's the first thing that people try without
Mm-hmm.
exploring other things, and also if that's something that's being distributed without being supervised by a physician. I don't think that's
Mm-hmm.
happening as much anymore, in the same way that I don't think college kids are sharing their ADHD meds with each other under the table. But I think there was a time where that was happening a little bit more.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's something that one experiments with, it definitely should be under the supervision of a physician who knows your medical history and can kind of make sure that you're okay and so forth.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I have a couple of practicing questions still before we finish up. So, one thing I was wondering also, how would you recommend starting a new piece in a way that we don't internalize bad habits right from the start? Like, how can we have a good, fresh start?
I don't know if there's like a proven scientific best practices, this is the most efficient way to learn a piece kind of thing, because I think it also depends on how much time you're going to have with it, like how well it needs to be learned, when it needs to be learned by, and so forth. Like if you need to learn something by rehearsal next week, then it's probably a different approach than if you're going to play this in 6 months and it really needs to be learned in a different level of depth. um, some musicians will say, listen to a lot of recordings. Some musicians will say, don't listen to any, maybe just one to get kind of a glance of it, but then don't come back to recordings until after you've come up with your own interpretation of it. This may not feel like it answers your question directly, but I think the thing that I worry a little bit more about is feeling like you need to learn a piece perfectly from the very beginning without making any mistakes, in the sense that then it leads to basically approaching the piece kind of carefully, if that makes sense. Like you're kind of baking in careful or cautious habits where like you're trying not to make mistakes, and you're giving up, or you're kind of not allowing yourself the opportunity to experiment and try different things and really explore the full range of what you might be able to do with a particular piece or passage. Um, they looked at this a little bit in the context of playing video games, and they found that the players who essentially kind of explored the range of possibilities more fully in the early going looked like they were making more mistakes, as it were, or like they weren't performing as well, but they ended up advancing quicker and getting to a higher level than the players who were much more kind of constrained or disciplined and trying a more narrow range of solutions around a particular problem. And so, I mean, there's even a video of Leon Fleischer talking about this in the masterclass, and it's talking about how, the practice room, feel free to experiment. I mean, he said there's no metronome police involved, and like you can try anything you want. And I don't think we need to worry as much as I think we do about that then becoming a bad habit. The problem is when we practice things mindlessly over and over, that's where the bad habits really get reinforced. I think if we're purposely or intentionally trying things that may not work, that's a different thing, because we're still very much focused and present and engaged and conscious about what it is that we're doing.
Okay, yeah. So basically, more mindful practice. That makes a lot of sense. And then I had one more question. How do we structure our practice best if we're tired? Because like I'm imagining all of these things and they sound so great, but it sounds like I have to just be so awake and attuned and really ready to concentrate. Versus sometimes and some days that's just not really a realistic prospect. And a lot of the times the time that I have to practice is more towards the end of the day, and then I'm already a little bit tired. So how can I transform tired practice still into mindful practice?
Well, one, I think taking a nap could be a helpful way to prepare for that late night practice session. Even if it's a 5 or 10 or 12 minute nap, I think
Mhm.
tiny nap better than no nap at all. Um, and they've actually looked at, coffee versus naps, and it seems that it's not so much the wakefulness that napping provides us, but there's something actually about the napping itself that helps with motor consolidation after the fact. And so yeah, I would say first off, give yourself permission to take a super short nap before you practice. The other I think that can help is, taking more breaks between, or not between, but like within the same practice session. Like maybe setting a timer where every 5 minutes you take a break or something like that, so that you're not going to have to sustain focus for like 45 minutes or an hour and a half. Like, every 5 minutes you're going to get to take a little breather, stand up, walk around the room, get something to drink, and so forth. Um, Sometimes it can feel like that interrupts our practice in a way that's kind of annoying, but I think it's a helpful way of making sure we don't start going off on mindless mode.
Mhm.
Um, it also helps us to be a little bit more, I think, intentional about setting goals for each little tiny chunk of practice, like having a very specific problem that we're trying to work on and so forth. I think the other thing that can help too is perhaps this is something that Pamela Frank recommended that I really liked. In her case, I think this came out of necessity from injury. Um, but one of the things that she's recommended is, just pick a set number of problems you want to find solutions to. And, you don't have to solve every problem, but it's better to, completely permanently solve like 3 problems than sort of semi solving a dozen problems. Even though I think in the moment, the semi solving a dozen feels more productive, but over time that really accumulates more effectively than if we're semi-solving problems. She, I think, at one point even suggested giving yourself a limited number of attempts or repetitions to solve a problem, which I like even more maybe, because that really forces you to kind of value each repetition a little bit more, where the goal isn't, let me see if I can solve this problem. The goal is, can I solve the problem in 5 repetitions or less? Because if I can't, then I have to move on to another problem and leave that other problem behind. I think little kind of games almost like that can perhaps help with staying more engaged or involved, even if our energy is kind of low and we don't feel, a huge amount of enthusiasm for practicing at that moment.
Yeah. Well, I think that's definitely going to change the way that I'll be practicing in the future. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, I think we're already at the end of all of my questions. So thank you so much for being here. We all really appreciate your support.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Okay.